Hello everyone, my name is Allison. I am a knitter based in Nebraska, and today I wanted to do like a little bit of a catch-up video, a what have I been knitting lately video, because I haven't done one of these in quite a while. I've been doing a lot of like individual project videos, so I have a lot to share with you today. So I guess we will jump right into finished objects. So my first finished object is a lento sweater. So the Crea Bea Knitting Podcast and I believe Amy Palco are doing a lento knit along, and this is a pattern that I have been eyeing for quite a while, and it was a great excuse to actually cast it on and get started with it. So I knit this with a yarn that I have had in my stash for many years. I ordered it from hobby.com, which is like a Danish company. And this is their Mayfair Cotton Merino Classic, I think is exactly what it's called. Don't know the number off the top of my head, but I'm sure I can figure it out. And this is not the type of yarn that is called for in the pattern. So the pattern calls for a skein of fingering weight and a skein of mohair. And I think it's the smallest two sizes in this pattern. You can knit with 2 skeins of each, which is kind of unheard of. But I knew for my version that I didn't want to have a fuzzy version, like an all over mohair, because I knew that that would get like itchy or sweaty, especially with like a closer fitting garment. So I went with a DK weight yarn instead. Now I've had this in my stash for ages because I only had 5 skeins of it, which is not that much. This took exactly 5 skeins, and this is what I have left over, which is a tiny amount. It is super cropped and it has 3/4 length sleeves. And because I was doing a tighter fitting version of this, I believe I knit the size 2. And because I was cropping it and like basically it's like a shrunken sweater for me, I knew that I didn't want to do ribbing for the arms, so I just did an I-cord bind off, which is I think the only modification that I have made to this pattern. There's another, I'm like just looking at this and there's another very obvious modification in that I didn't do a provisional cast on. So this sweater is meant to have a provisional cast on so that you can just knit the ribbing together and have a folded ribbed neckline like that. And I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to have that look of the folded collar, and I knew that I didn't want to do a provisional cast on, so I just didn't. I did a regular long tail cast on. I knit the collar quite long, so I would have the option of folding it down if I wanted to, or I could leave it as kind of like a mock neck turtleneck if I wanted to do that too. And I do think that the mock turtleneck looks really cute. Like I think that it's a really cute look for this sweater. However, it's super itchy on my neck, so I think I will probably end up just folding it down and stitching it down instead. I am so glad that I have this pattern now because it is such an easy raglan sweater. It's just top down. You can, do what I did and choose not to do the provisional cast on, and it makes it a lot easier at the very beginning. And then it's knit with pretty large needles. So I think it's knit on size 10 needles. The fit of the pattern as it's written is a little bit cropped. It has shorter sleeves, but obviously those are modifications that are super easy to lengthen to whatever length you have, depending on how much yarn you have. And now that I say that, I remember another modification that I made. Sorry, I knit this in the very beginning of January and it knits up so quickly that I've kind of forgotten what I've done, but I did do some waist shaping that you might be able to see here just on the body to narrow it down a little bit and to also save on yarn. I was getting a little bit worried that I was going to run out, and I didn't, thank God, but I have finished this and I have not worn it yet because of the whole will I, won't I fold down the neck thing. And because I was thinking I have this tiny amount of yarn left and I have the same yarn in a slightly darker color that I thought would be really cute to do like tone on tone floral embroidery. This is a trend on like knitting Instagram that I have seen over and over again. I think Pleistre Knitwear does a really beautiful job of embroidering on knitwear, and it's something that I've always wanted to do, but I'm also just like I don't know, my knits are kind of like precious and I don't want to mess them up, and I don't want to like, you know, distort any of the stitches while like putting the embroidery on, because I know you can always take the embroidery off if you like hate it. I think that this is a great sweater for testing out some tone on tone embroidery. I just think it would look really cool. It's very, very springy because of the color, and I think having another color that's just a little bit darker will help it to stand out a little bit better. I have been knitting a lot of drop shoulder sweaters lately, and I have another work in progress that is a drop shoulder sweater, and it was really nice just to do a classic raglan yoke. I really like raglan yokes. I find them very intuitive for me to do. I love these kind of increases with the knit front and back. I really like how that looks because it has that little bar that I feel like it's not trying to be invisible. Like your increases are never going to be completely invisible, and I think it makes it more of a feature instead of like trying to make it disappear. We are in like that weird part of the end of winter where like tomorrow I think it's supposed to be like 60 degrees, and then the following weekend is going to be 30 degrees and snowing. So this being like a light cotton and merino mix, and it's short, super cropped. I don't think I'm going to be wearing this until we get into like spring, but I have been thinking about doing like an embroider with me little video where I do like the embroidery for this sweater. If that is something that you would be interested in, please let me know in the comments. So my next finished object is my sporty little v-neck sweater. I won't spend too long on this because I did do an entire video talking about my process with this sweater, because I did self-draft this whole pattern and I'm so happy with it. So I do want to talk about it just a little bit and cover a couple of things that I think I forgot to mention in the video. So this sweater was knit in Wool and the Gang's Shiny Happy Cotton, and it's another yarn that I have had in my stash for absolutely ages. My husband gave it to me for Christmas. I'm pretty sure it was Christmas 2019. It was meant to be my first sweater, and he chose a very bold color. And so it sat in my stash for a very long time. I was meant to knit, I think it's called like the Hello Sailor sweater or something like that. He got me like the kit for it from Wool and the Gang, and it was meant to be red with white stripes, and I wasn't like super digging the idea of red with white stripes, so I ended up just buying enough to do white with red stripes, and then I never knit that sweater. So basically I bought enough white yarn to knit an entire sweater with, and I knit this Chika sweater instead, which is very, very different, although I am kind of glad. I think there's a little bit of like controversy with Wool and the Gang patterns in that they are not written how most people knit nowadays. They are knit, pretty much everything is knit flat because they only sell straight knitting needles. And the dimensions of that sweater are a little bit wonky. I think it's knit at like a really loose gauge too. Either way, that sweater never got knit, but instead I got this one and this one out of that Christmas present from my husband. So the red shade is lipstick red, the white is I'm sure just called white, and then the pink I actually dyed myself with avocado pits, again, many years ago, and shockingly, the color has stayed very like bright pink this whole time. So it's been at least 2 years since I dyed this pink yarn, and just like on my own, I'm not a yarn dyer. This comes with like very little pre-knowledge on natural dyes, but the avocado pits with cotton yarn took really, really well, and I love the color that came from it. So this sweater has quite a boxy, oversized fit. I knew that I wanted to do like the contrasting ribbing to break up all of the red because the red is very bold, and I knew I wanted to do a sporty kind of v-neck sweater, so I ended up with what I believe is called a cricket sweater, and I think it turned out really cute. It is definitely more of a like springy fall kind of weight of a sweater, especially because it's cotton. I have this thing with cotton yarn where anytime you read any kind of article or like video or anything about summer knitting, people always talk about cotton yarn as if it's like a great yarn to use for summer knitting, and I completely disagree. When we lived in Louisiana, obviously the weather is significantly warmer than it is in Nebraska, and during the summer, I wasn't going to wear any knitwear anyway, but like the majority of the year is going to be much, much warmer than basically the entire year in Nebraska. So to be able to wear a sweater in like the fall, it needs to be pretty lightweight and breathable so that you can wear it and not overheat, because it's still like probably 80 degrees. All of that is to say, I was very invested in like, what's the best summer yarns? And anytime we have like a cotton yarn, I find them so heavy. And I find oftentimes cotton yarns are at like a heavier weight. So I believe this is technically an Aran weight yarn. The sweater itself is immensely heavy, like it's incredibly heavy. It is not a lightweight fiber. And also cotton, when it gets wet, like if you were to get sweaty in it, it takes ages to dry. Like it's not something that evaporates super quickly, even though people always say it does. What I'm trying to say is that like a cotton sweater for me is not an equivalent to like a cotton t-shirt when it's 100 degrees out. But if we are talking like 60, maybe 50 to 70 degrees, you can definitely wear cotton as like a lightweight sweater, in my opinion. And I think that this is going to be perfect, especially for fall. I ended up doing an Italian bind off on the neckline and on the ribbing for the arms, not for the bottom, because I knit it bottom up. And honestly, an Italian cast on is so finicky for me. I always find like I can do it, but when you're doing like an invisible style cast on where you're casting on knits and purls, I always find that my yarn or like my cast on gets twisted around my cable. And then when it's time to actually like start knitting into it, I have a really difficult time figuring out if the stitch has been twisted all the way around or not, which can give you like a Mobius strip if you're not careful. And it's just like a lot of effort. So I did do, I think, yeah, a twisted German cast on for the bottom of this sweater. This is my second sweater that I have knit without a pattern, or I've written the pattern for myself, and it went so much easier than the first time that I did it. And I find it such a fun challenge to try to figure out how to make the construction of a sweater. And it is just like, I am full to the brim of ideas of sweaters that I would like to create for myself, but we will get into that a little bit later. So next up in finished objects you might have missed is my sideline shawl pattern. So this is a pattern that I drafted between December and January, and it is out for release now. You can find a link for it in the description, along with a video. I did a whole video explaining basically everything about this shawl, but it is a full-sized kind of scarfy shawl. Like you can knit it or you can wear it classic scarf style, but the pattern also comes with instructions to make a little mini version if you want to wear like a little mini scarfette. My whole goal when I was like coming up with this shawl pattern was to use as close to 2 full skeins of like a special fingering weight yarn that you've like had in your stash, you've got on vacation. You know how these like single skeins of fingering weight yarn can accumulate, especially if you're me. And in my stash, I have so many single skeins of fingering weight sock yarn, and I really wanted to find a way to like use them in their entirety and really show off the yarn. Because this is like, whenever I'm buying indie yarn, I have this bad habit of really only buying 1 skein of fingering weight yarn because you can make a pair of socks out of that pretty easily. However, there's only so many socks that one girl can wear, and my husband doesn't like hand knit socks, so what am I gonna do but figure out how to knit entire shawl. So this is a diamond shaped shawl. It is color blocked. You can either do one color on each side, or you can do it like this with color quadrants, and it has an applied I-cord at the end to kind of really seal the deal on all of the color blocking. The inside of the, not the inside, the bulk of the shawl is knit in intarsia. It is a really good first intarsia project because your lines never move. So this center line is always going to be in the center. It makes it really easy to switch your colors and not forget and keep going. And it gets you like a very graphic end result. I really like a stark color block. Like if you're doing a color block, like go for it. I have knit so many of these in December and January because I knit a bunch of these little mini versions. I also worked with my local yarn store to basically promote the shawl with some hand-dyed yarn from a local dyer, which was really cool. So they have a sample in the shop and they had the yarn with the sample available for purchase. And that was really cool. It was very special for me to be able to do that, and for Angie, who's the owner of the shop, to like say yes to me when I just reached out and I was like, hey, I've got this idea and let's partner together. I don't think I mentioned that this version, my like full-sized version, both of these yarns are Sorella sock yarn. The darker green is Ivy from their Taylor Swift collection, I'm sure years ago at this point, and the lighter green is Aloe from Spring Tonals, again, probably years ago at this point. And obviously I purchased them independently. They were two different drops and I didn't purchase them to go together, but I just really liked both of these greens. I love this aloe color. It is such a unique, like pastel light green with a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of variation. It's really hard to pick up on via the camera, but you can see it in real life. And then the shade Ivy, it's a pretty uniform dark green, but again, it has almost like a heathered appearance to it with the little bit of variation in the skein. And I've had these two yarns in my stash forever. I'm really glad that I was able to use them together because I think they go together so well and I think it's really cute. And I have knit like 4, I think, mini versions of this shawl as well. So I will put a link to all of them in the description below. So that is it for all of my finished objects, but I do have a couple of works in progress to share with you, and I want to start with my pressed flowers shawl. This is a pattern by Amy Christoffers, or Savory Knitting, that I am sure you have seen because she has turned the like motif into this shawl, and there's a hat. There's, I think, an infinity scarf. There's definitely a cardigan, which I kind of wanted it too. I think it looks so good. I think it's Erin from Coast to Coast Yarn Company had somebody knit her a sample of the cardigan in her yarns with like a dark red as like the background color. What I have is the dark purple, and like a cream color for the flowers, and it looks so cool. But I have to finish the shawl first. I just realized that I have another work in progress of a different shawl that is upstairs in the attic that I like put away because it's on hold for the time being. I forgot to bring down to show you, so I guess I'm just gonna leave that as a little surprise for next video. But back on track to this shawl. So I am knitting this. Loud cars, so rude. So I am knitting this in Barocco Remix Light in the shades, let's see, we just have color numbers. So the dark purple is 6973 and the lighter purple is 6917. So this yarn is made from 100% recycled fibers that are put back together into a new yarn. It is a mix of nylon, cotton, acrylic, silk, and linen. I really, really like this yarn. It is knitting up into like the most inside of an old sweatshirt material that you can think of. Like, so you know, an old sweatshirt that you've had in your closet forever and you wear it on a cold Saturday morning. The inside, how it has that like nubbly kind of texture to the sweatshirt material. That's what this feels like. It is so nice, it's so soft, it's really, really lightweight. It just has that like little bit of nubbiness that just feels so good. Looking at like the yarn itself, it kind of looks like a soft raw silk. So I've knit with the Pearl Soho, what do you call it? Cattail silk, Pearl Soho cattail silk. The texture of that yarn is quite similar, except for that's much more stiff because silk yarn by itself, it's not very, there's like very little ease and relaxation, I guess, to the silk fibers. This feels really similar in that kind of nubbly texture to the yarn, but it's much softer. It is very like loose and relaxed of a fiber to knit with, and it has all of these almost like tweedy nibs throughout. It gives it like a really soft color variation, and I think it just looks really nice. I do kind of wish that they had left the linen out of this mix because it does stick out, like it literally sticks out of the yarn, and I have found myself literally just picking out the strands of the linen fiber as I go because they are noticeably not really enmeshed with the rest of the fibers. For some reason, they consider this a DK weight yarn. I would absolutely not consider this a DK weight yarn. You could push for a sport weight, but I would consider this to be a fingering weight yarn. And I will show an example of like a regular DK weight yarn compared with a strand of this DK weight yarn, where you can see the difference. And the example that I have right next to me that I will show you, obviously I know has a different type of spin, it's a different material. This one's wool, these are not wool. And I know that this spin and all those kinds of things will change how the yarn itself looks before it's knit up. However, it's really, really, really light for a DK weight yarn. It is not what I would consider DK weight, but that is just me. They do have the same mix, like the remix line, I guess, from Barocco in, I think, a worsted weight and like a bulky weight. I know that I have not finished this project yet, but I'm like so into this yarn that I'm like planning maybe two different sweaters with this yarn. I definitely want to do a more lightweight one with the Remix Light, and then probably a bulky oversized sweater with one of the thicker versions. But that is absolutely enough about the yarn. Let's talk about the pattern. Now, this is also knit in intarsia, and part of the reason why I chose it is I have this idea like in my mind for an intarsia shawl, and I can picture it and I know what it looks like, but it's a little bit more complicated than any kind of intarsia project that I have knit before, and I wanted to basically prep myself for a more complicated intarsia knit by knitting this shawl. It starts off with a teeny tiny provisional cast on with like a tiny number of stitches, and you put those stitches like on hold, and you're supposed to sew them up at the end, but I already sewed them up, and it's created a perfectly flat line for the start of this shawl, because you start with a teeny tiny number of stitches and then you're increasing every row to make it larger. And I think it looks really nice. One thing that I really don't like about shawls that start, with a small number of stitches and grow outwards is that oftentimes you get like a little bump with the first couple of rows because there's more stitches than can kind of fit, and it kind of gives you a weird like bump like right here on that first beginning of the shawl. So I think that was a really clever way of starting this kind of shape for a shawl and avoiding having like a different little texture or a little tab here. I think it just meshes really, really nicely with the way that the like stitches are handled at the very beginning of the shawl. For the motif itself, they do have both a chart and written instructions for the flower motif, like that goes row by row. I personally find charts much easier to read than reading row by row of knitting, so it's very helpful for me to at least have the option of both, especially at the very beginning of this shawl when you don't have like the rhythm of how the stitches work like kind of in the back of your mind. It is a little bit of a brain teaser. You're just kind of like, okay, like whatever you say, if that's how we're knitting this. So I think it's really helpful not only to have the chart to see what you're doing, but to also have the written instructions to go back and be like, is row 17 really like this? And seeing it fully written out. Now that I have a few repeats in, I do have a better understanding of how like the pattern works, and I don't have to refer to the pattern quite as much, which is really helpful for me because I don't like to have to sit there and read a pattern as I'm knitting. I'd rather I would rather like read the knitting itself to know like if on the last row I did this, that means on this next row I have to do this. In general, that's just how I prefer how to do any kind of knitting, but especially color work. The only times that I have been referring back to the pattern is at the very beginning of the flower to double check how many stitches you need to do before you start the flower and how many stitches in between each flower. But this is like barely started at this point, so I'm sure by the end of the shawl I will remember how many stitches go in between each flower, and we will be just sailing through this pattern. This shawl also has kind of like a border at the very end. Like basically the pattern goes from like these spread out flowers to much more like compact, like the flowers are closer together for like the last couple of repeats. And I don't love how that looks, so I'm probably not going to add that bit to the shawl, but we will see how far I get. I only have these 2 balls of yarn, but they have, let's see, how many yards? Each ball is 432 yards, which is plenty. That's like a very generous amount of yarn for 1 ball. And I am not particularly picky on how big a shawl is. I mean, obviously I want it bigger than this, but once I start getting to like the ends of these balls, I will just cast off. So my last work in progress that I have to show you is a weekender sweater by Andrea Mowry. This is one of those sweaters that I feel like everyone has knit and I've just never gotten around to it, but I'm doing it now. I have, I think, like 1 full foot of the body from the back cast on edge because it has a split hem and the front hem is slightly shorter than the back hem, and I have a couple more inches to go on the body before separating the front and back to knit the front and back. I have this flipped inside out so you can see how it would be worn. It is knit in reverse stockinette, but you're just knitting it in stockinette and putting these slipped stitches for like the faux seam detail on what is the backside of your work as you're working. But it's worn with this reverse stockinette side out. So I am knitting this in another very old stash yarn. This is the Lion brand jeans yarn that I got like when that yarn came out and it was being used by everybody. So this shade is called Vintage. I have used this yarn before in like a really pretty like orangey sienna kind of color, which I think is called Top Stitch, for another one of my Chika sweaters. So I will link that video somewhere so you can see it. But for an acrylic yarn, this is really nice. It's very soft to the touch. It doesn't have that like crinkly acrylic feel to it at all. Like it doesn't feel any kind of way on your skin as you're knitting. The finished object is quite soft and it washes really well from my experience with my other sweater. The color of this I feel like looks pretty similar to her example sweater, like the sweater that you see on the pattern, which was not necessarily intentional. I was just kind of digging through my stash recently and like found that I had a sweater's quantity worth of this yarn and thought that it would be a good fit. And I'm really liking how it is working up so far. Obviously, there's nothing really to try on yet. I am knitting the second size, which is not necessarily the size I'm supposed to knit for this sweater. I think I should be knitting size 3, but I didn't want it to be quite so oversized as that would wear on me. This is another drop shoulder sweater design, and it has kind of like a boat neck. I think what I might end up doing when I get to the boat neck is it has the width of the boat neck, I feel like is a little too long, like what is recommended in the pattern. It's the kind of thing like no matter what, your bra strap is gonna show. So I think I will probably just sew up, or however, I haven't gotten to the instructions yet, but however we are finishing off the neckline, I'm probably going to make my neckline just a little bit closer into the neck so that whatever I'm wearing underneath the sweater is not obviously showing. But that is just like a personal preference thing for me, because I'm pretty much always going to be wearing a shirt underneath my sweaters so I don't have to wash them as often. But I suppose that's not necessarily something that's a huge consideration for this acrylic yarn, because it's very easy to wash, as I have done with my other sweater. I am really excited to have this finished though. I know it's like slightly boring to knit a all over gray sweater, but it's going to be so wearable that I'm going to get a ton of use out of it. Whereas I feel like I have knit I've knit a couple of all over colorwork sweaters and I don't really wear them all that often. I just find them like harder to incorporate into my wardrobe, and I'm trying to be very conscious of choosing patterns and choosing yarn colors that work with my clothing so I actually wear them. And I think that this is going to be a really good example of that, of knitting a pattern that's maybe not so exciting, but is going to be incredibly wearable. Now you may have noticed that all of my works in progress are not being made with wool yarn. There's one very specific reason for that, is that I think I might have an allergy to lanolin, which just really sucks. But I wanted to talk about it because I know it's not uncommon, but here is like the story of what is happening, what's happened. Basically, throughout like November and December of last year, my lips were like constantly super dry, and it like didn't matter what lip balm that I was using, like nothing was helping them not feel incredibly dry. So at the end of December, I got like a lanolin only lip balm. Like it's just lanolin, and I was like, this is gonna be great. It's going to like solve all my problems. Everyone says that lanolin is this great moisturizer, and it worked really well for like 2 days, and then my lips freaked out, and they haven't stopped ever since. So essentially what has happened is my dermatologist thinks that I've had an allergic contact dermatitis from the lanolin lip balm. So I stopped using that lip balm like immediately, but for a while, like basically all of January, I was still knitting with wool, and it was just taking absolutely ages for my lips to heal. So I put away all of my wool and basically brought out all of my non-wool yarns to knit with to see if that would help, and it did. Which is the part of this that sucks, because I have a ton of super woolly wools that definitely have a ton of lanolin left in them. And right now I'm at a little bit of an impasse of what to do. So I am having in a couple of weeks like an allergy test to see exactly what it is that I'm allergic to so I can avoid it. I think lanolin is probably definitely going to end up being on that list, which is unfortunate. Essentially, what I'm loosely planning on doing right now is continuing to avoid all lanolin-y products, like knitting with all of my non-wool yarns for the time being until after the test at least. And then I want to start testing different yarns to see if I can use them, basically. I have already tested one of my more woolly yarns. Actually, it's not that woolly. It's like in between my like super woolly yarns and my like super wash, basically super processed wools. It's kind of in between, and that one failed. It did not pass my will it irritate my skin test, so we are going to test next like a super wash wool sock yarn to see if that is going to have an impact. But long and short, for the time being, I'm going to be avoiding using my woolly wools besides when I knit this little swatch. So I do want to show you this because I love it. So I knit this little like sample basically with Hairsville Designs Daylights yarn, which I think is so beautiful. It's a really lovely yarn, and I wish that right now my skin wasn't reacting to it, but I basically was playing around with different cable patterns because I have this like vision of a raglan style sweater with a cable panel in front and back, and then a slightly different design just down like the top of the sleeves. but I was playing around with different cable patterns and I came up with one that I really like. It's gonna need like a little bit of tweaking. I will show you like a close-up so you can see it more easily. But I had put together a couple of different like larger cables or more interesting cables for the very center, and then basically smaller as you go out. My original idea for the center like columns was stacked cables, like having a bunch of little cables stacked on top of each other. And I thought that it was a cool looking idea, but then I knit the swatch and you just like can't see them at all. Like they melt into the fabric like they weren't even there. So before like casting off this little swatch, I actually dropped down and created like 2 cables that were just larger cable patterns out of these same center panels so I could see how both would look after blocking it. And I really like how the larger cables look. So eventually it feels very autumnal, like I'm not going to knit this for the summer, but I really like this general idea. I'm just going to have to, at least right now, knit it in a different yarn because this did not pass the test of will it irritate my skin. And on like that note, I really want to hear from people in the comments if you have a lanolin allergy or a lanolin sensitivity. What do you do? Like, do you always avoid all wool? Do you find that superwash wool tends to be okay? I actually got the Knitter's Book of Yarn recently, which like, how 2005 is this cover? It just screams. I feel like this looks like an American Girl doll book. I don't know why, it just gives me that energy. I kind of wonder when it was written. Let's see. Yeah, this was written in 2007. So that explains why the cover looks like that. But this is a book by Clara Parks, and I've barely dug into it, and it's already so informative. I did read a little bit about what she says about wool and lanolin allergies, which is something of a, like, don't know what to call it, like a pet peeve almost. I mean, this has only been relevant in my life for like 2 months, but there is discussion apparently from 2007 until now about whether or not wool or lanolin allergies are real allergies, because typically someone who is sensitive to wool or lanolin doesn't have like anaphylaxis, like they're still able to breathe. It just causes like skin irritation. And so there's discussion about whether or not that's an actual allergy or if that's a sensitivity. The reason why that's a pet peeve for me is it feels kind of pedantic, where like at the end of the day, if you can't use that thing because it creates so much discomfort or irritation for your skin that it's unusable, then why does it matter if we're calling it a sensitivity versus an allergy? But that's just me. But she was saying in that section that I've read so far is that if you are someone who is sensitive to lanolin, obviously there's plenty of other fibers to choose from, not just like acrylic or like man-made fibers. There's plenty of animal fibers that are also lanolin free, but she did recommend trying just washing your yarn. So like for a yarn that is pretty like raw or like low process, which is a yarn that I particularly do like, because that has been so low process, like it hasn't been washed a bunch of times and you might find like vegetable matter and stuff like that in it. She recommends just washing those skeins before use, which does seem like kind of a pain, but if anybody has done that, I would love to hear if that actually worked for you. Because this yarn, which is the Daylights by Hairsville, it's not like super rustic, but it's not overly processed either. And this did end up irritating my skin as I was knitting this. I also think I need to do a test of wearing one of my woolier sweaters. I have been like totally avoiding all of my woolly wool sweaters that I have knit, which basically leaves me with like 3 sweaters to wear that I have knit myself, which is what it is for the moment, but I really should try to see if it's just like when I'm working with it, like if it's touching my skin and that's just like getting up into the air or whatever it is that is bothering my skin, or if I can wear a finished wool sweater and have that irritate my skin. Either way, lots to think about, lots to learn. I'm really glad that I got this book either way. It is really thick. It is quite like a tome. But so far, I mean, I'm literally like 30 pages into this and I've learned a lot. I really want to see if I can I want to see if I have any sensitivities to any other like animal fibers. So she recommends like Angora, anything that's not like a wool animal fiber, I feel like is so much more expensive, but she recommends like Angora, cashmere, alpaca, all of those kinds of yarn as being a good alternative to wool if you have any kind of sensitivities to wool or lanolin. So I do want to try and see if any of those fibers irritate my skin also. I have the pattern for the Stockholm sweater V-neck by Petite Knit, which is meant to be knit in 2 strands of silk mohair. And I have enough in my stash of undyed, just white silk mohair to be able to knit that sweater. I do think that that would be incredibly extra, like an all over pure white, very fuzzy, like oversized V-neck. Like, I feel like it's giving angel energy, like very angelic to be very like fuzzy and all over white. So that, I guess, is an option with the yarn that I already have, but for the time being, I'm trying to avoid buying any yarn, and the only yarn that I have bought has been wool-free, just until I have like a better handle on what's going on allergy or sensitivity wise. And if it turns out that I do have like a pretty significant lanolin allergy or lanolin sensitivity, I think what I might do is continue to test and like knit a little swatch, see if I have a reaction to the yarn. And if I do, I might end up having to do like a pretty significant yarn destash or my mom and my mother-in-law are gonna have great birthdays and Mother's Days this year as I give them my woolier wools that I might not be able to use. But as it stands, all of this is like a month or 2 away for me to do the test and get the results. We will see how all of that goes and what I decide to do from there. Okay, allergy talk is done, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about like future knitting plans of what I'm planning to do, kind of with my fiber sensitivities in mind. So obviously I'm working on this weekender sweater, and I have this cable knit sweater pattern that I would like to knit, although it's slightly unseasonal. I feel like a cable sweater, it feels very fall. It does not feel very springtime to me. So I have a couple of things that I'm thinking of knitting. The first is a Summer Sweater V-neck by the Knit Pearl Girl. So when I bought this yarn of the Remix Light, of the purple and light purple, I also got this gorgeous dark green color, and I need to swatch it because, like I said, this says that it's a DK weight yarn, and I disagree. It is generous to call it a sport weight. I have found with the Knit Pearl Girl that she has a tighter tension than I have. So I'm curious if knitting with a slightly thinner yarn than what she calls for, if it'll end up kind of evening out. Either way, hasn't been swatched for yet, but I think that like nubbly kind of yarn in an oversized V-neck sweater is going to be so cute. I think that will be incredibly wearable. And I still really want to knit a cardigan for spring. I was thinking of knitting the Pippin cardigan, also by the Knit Pearl Girl. She has I swear this is going to become like a Knit Pearl Girl stan account in a not weird way, but I also got her most recent pattern that she just released for the Farnham sweater. Ooh, I cannot wait to have that in my like sweater collection. But for these two sweaters, the Farnham sweater and the Pippin cardigan, I need to be really careful in my yarn choice. So if you have any recommendations for a non-wool yarn, because that's what I'm trying to do at least for the next couple of months, please put them down in the comments. I think both of them are a DK weight, or it's meant to be like a single strand of fingering weight yarn held double with a strand of mohair. And I don't think for either of them that I would want that mohair in it, because they are, for me, like a lighter spring fall kind of sweater, where the mohair I think would just be too warm. It would make me kind of itchy. So I think no matter what, whatever the fiber content is, I was never going to do the held double with mohair. So if you have any DK weight yarn recommendations for me, please let me know. That's it. That is all I have to share with you today. I would love to know what you are working on in the comments, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.